the following subnet. What I want to do first is to do a dissolve flat edges. For this you need the labs setup. We're going to be doing this. There's a null, and let's say we have shapes again. There we go. What this node does is, well, it basically dissolves all edges which are not flat. So you can see we have still all our subdivisions, and now we have some bunch of concave shapes as well sometimes, especially where we've cut out something. But this is definitely something we can now start using and start to subdivide it in the way we see fit. For example, this shape right now, if you right now would throw this into one of many HDAs to generate detail, it's quite hard usually to kind of figure out where is which type of detail, where's the edge of the door, where are the corner parts. We want to have a little bit more information to do our stuff with. Let me open Paint. So we can see this shape we had beforehand. For example, a shape like this. Maybe it's a little bit irregular. Let's say this is our shape. The subdivisions I want to make, or at least have control of to make, are basically some horizontal and vertical cuts, which I want. And then probably a couple of cuts horizontally wherever the terrain is. And that's basically how I want to subdivide this. So we have a little bit more control of, regarding the placement later on. All right, let's do this. There's a bunch of different methods in Houdini that you can use to generate cuts. There is a clip node. Let me just quickly show you what the clip node does, which has very useful applications. We won't be using it, but it has definitely use cases, so figure out what you want to do. Here you can see the clip node. Basically it's a plane and it clips stuff, and we can keep stuff above, you can see keep stuff below. What I've noticed when creating building tools is that this slicing method is usually where your building tool starts to break. There's different ways you can do slicing. So we have the clip node. You could use a divide node and then set it to polybreaker, and by changing with the scale. So first let's turn off the convex polygons. Hide this one, and let's turn polybreakers on. But this is the way you could start dividing up your shape. Still, we keep some weird concave shapes over here. And if we would only want to generate one slice, for example, just like with the plane, we could do some very large scale for those two. And also set the scale a little bit larger for here. Like you could control this to also get a slice where you want. Especially once you start to hit these edges over here, you get weird tiny slivers. This is, I found it very hard to make it work. There's probably use cases where this one is more stable, but I don't like this one too much for this specific use case. We have now the divide, we have the clip. There are more methods. I'm gonna jump into the one that we will be using. That is actually the Voronoi node. Because this Voronoi fracture node has one option I really like. Let's say we are going to grab a input point, and that input point is going to be our plane of cutting. Let's say for now we're only doing it horizontally. I'm going to use add. This add node will be adding our point. This is going to be our cutting plane, because we're going to spawn basically a horizontal plane on this point. We have our input shape. Here. Shape again. So we'll later put this in a subnet. And we have a null node. Oh, a null node. It's going to be the cutting plane, which we keep as a point. Then this point I will transform twice. Once it will go up, once it will go down. And when it goes down, doesn't really matter how much we're transforming them up and down, as long as those two values are the same. Let's merge this again. And now this Voronoi node will generate a cutting plane between those two values. How high are we up? Let's see, I think we're kind of in the right spot. Yeah, that's correct. We need to set some settings for this no fracture node. We don't need those internal surfaces. And you can see this is the height of our point, our input point. That's where it gets created. So if we now move this point up a little bit, you can see we are generating a cut in this input shape. Now the cool thing, especially if we get to this sliver over here, if we get it basically on the same point, where normally this would be problematic once we have shapes like this, or if it's a perfect match, or many different things that could happen over here. With the Voronoi fracture node, we have this cut plane offset we can use. And this means that kind of in a healthy way, we could say, all right, we really don't care too much about too much. So let's just set this to a very low number, depending on how off our initial input would be. This way, we have a lot more control to make this very clean and not get a lot of weird tiny polygons left around. Later on, we could, for example, fuse this back together. There's many things we could do to make this very stable. Let's for now use this. So this is going to be its own subnet, which is going to be a output as well. Say this is cut horizontal. There we go. Later we can also make one which is vertical, just that one requires a little bit more finesse. Still, it's very doable. Let's first set up something else. So over here, we want to start looping over each different primitive. And I'm actually going to ignore the top primitives for now. So let's separate the two of those as well. I'm going to group based on normals. And I want normals pointing upwards. Let's actually set this a bit lower. All right, and I'm just going to call this for now. And for now, we're blasting the roof. And this is what we will be looping over. Next up, we'll place a for loop. We're going to do a for each loop, for each primitive. This is actually also a nice moment to just place a prim wrangle and to store some attributes. Over here, I'm going to set, let's set a facade ID, face ID. Let's set this with text. Set it to prim number. Right now, if we would to start to lose our prim numbers, we always can point back to the parent prim, which is going to be this number. Let's loop over this. Now what I want to do is grab basically every point, and I'm going to throw this into this loop. So let's grab all different points. And we're going to need another for loop for this, because we're going to do a lot of cuts. To be a for each point. Place an add. Over here, we want to delete geometry, but keep the points. And we're going to be looping over each point. We need to have another one, and this one is going to be fetching feedback. This is just fetching the different points for each loop. And then the second for each is going to fetch feedback. So whatever we're throwing down here is going to come back from this node. This node also needs to have the input, the original input, because that's the plane we will be cutting multiple times. This, let's make sure that this old block path is also set correctly. Our input as well. Just, oh, of course, find this thing. Oh, there we go. I'll find the fix. Here we go. All right, so we have our over here. We have our point that's going to be doing the cutting. You could like remove, like sort these on height and then remove the first and last. Let's actually just do that. That's a nice little optimization, and also just to show you the flexibility of this. We have our input points. We would sort this based on their height. Why? Right now you can see their point numbers are all sorted correctly. We can do a blast to delete number 0. Well, yes, delete number 0. And then we could repeat this in the other direction. Now we can do this again. Point sort. And this would work even better if our original points are all scaled in their horizontal axis to the same place, and then we could place a fuse, so we are certain we don't have points living around here. Perfect. And now we know for certain we're not doing double stuff or things like that. This is also a place where if you would, for example, want to add your own dividing line between different levels of your building, for example, different floors or specific trim you want somewhere, it's also, you could just merge that in here, it would still work. We're still dividing that. And later on, you could even maybe group that to keep control over where you are adding that information. For now, we can just throw this in because we have our input points. We have the plane we want to do the cut in, and we have this subnet with the Voronoi inside. Add the two of those. See if I added them correctly. Nope. There we go. Which do I have? Over here you can see I'm doing this cut, and I'm going to lower this by a considerable amount. We check if our original input also had basically 2 points over there. Yes, alright, so this is something that happens quite a lot usually when placing shapes quite organically like this. Or it could even be because our input was not fused. Let me double check something. We did our cubes. Let's see what happens if we place a fuse over our input cubes. Quickly check how geometry number. No, so that. Alright, let's go back. Because it also doesn't really matter. Go back to the slicing. They are just like literally 2 points very close to each other. That's fine. Could fuse them with a little bit larger range, for example, or could even fuse them beforehand. But for now, this is fine. It really doesn't matter because that's why I'm using the Voronoi, because it's very sturdy and this basically cannot break. All right, let's put this into the for loop. Second for loop, actually. And now you can see we have a bunch of cutting planes, and I think we're merging each iteration Want to feedback each iteration. Perfect. Alright, we now have just a bunch of horizontal slices, and something that's very important from this is now we are basically regaining our concavity or our convexity. Only convex shapes, which is something that a lot of tools like a lot. Now just to make sure, like some people would need this, some people don't need this, let me show you guys how to do this for vertical slices, because that's a little bit more tricky. So let's do this to the side actually. So we have this original cut subnet. Probably nice to make a HDA out of that. For now, we're going to redo a bunch of this. Let me actually copy this over, and we're also going to add this to a subnet and call this slice example. And now I'm going to copy this over. Slice vertical. And then we'll dive into this one. What's important to know is that these types of operations, like these slicers, these vertical horizontal slicers, and also these Boolean operations, it's nice to kind of group them together, put them in subnets, because if you're making a very, very complex building system, it's very often you start to use them quite a bit, and it's just nice to have them grouped so you know their function, and it's easy to play around with those configurations, how many times you're slicing, and play around with that, because it definitely becomes a little bit more artistic after you've set up these mathematical functions. So into the vertical slice. Over here we are going to keep it relatively similar, and let me find points again. Right now we don't have the luxury of like transforming them to the middle, because we need this. What we do have is the luxury of it can go to the same plane, to 0 basically. It's our 0 right now, and we can do the same method, but right now you would need to do a sort based on a attribute that we're going to be needing, and well, we have to create that attribute anyways. So let's go. We have a primitive wrangle over here. I want to have normal also set up. Normal, set it to be primitives. Right now we have a primitive normal pointing outwards of this primitive, which is actually very simple right now. Then what I want is to basically get a tangent of this primitive, which I'm going to call forward. The way I'm getting that is by getting the cross product of the up vector and the normal. And the normal is n, and up vector we can just set it ourselves. There we go. Because the up vector is just the direction pointing upwards, and normal is pointing outwards from the primitive. And right now, because we're doing the cross product, and basically what a cross product is, if imagine you have two pencils. Let me open Paint again. If you would have two pencils, and one pencil is pointing any direction, and the other pencil is basically locked on it by 90 degrees. Or it doesn't have to, but that's what we do have right now with our normals. The cross product would give you the outward direction if you would be going into the third dimension from the initial two pencils. That's what the cross product does, and that's why we are using it right now, because we need this forward attribute to be offsetting our points, because we need to, for a vertical slice, for example this point, it needs to move a little bit to the right, and it needs to move a little bit to the left. Then we are going to get our cutting plane, and that's why we need this forward value. Now we have this. We can throw this in here again. Let me actually promote it to points as well, because we are removing the primitive over there. I still want to use it for the sort. Primitive to point. We're grabbing the forward value. And then here, perfect. Now we have a forward value. Let's actually check if we can see this forward value. Adding scene visualizer marker. I'm going to call this forward, and the attribute we're looking for, which is a vector, and what we're visualizing right now. Perfect. So that's the direction we're going to be offsetting our points in, and also how we will be sorting them. Initially, we just did it on the y-axis. It's very good to do, but right now we want this one to, instead of do it by y, we have a vector we want to do this along. And the vector was, let me check. What we need to do is to place another null node over here, because I want this forward from the primitive actually. Let's call this out forward. And in the sort, we're going to point towards this node. We have a point with prim attributes. Forward. And what we need is it from the very first primitive. And then we need to have forward attributes and then the right index. Right now that's 0. And that should actually be 0 right now as well. Let me double check what the forward was. Yes, perfect. And let's copy this over and get indices well. There we go. It's set to 1. Right now we have our vector for each primitive. We're doing it at the start of our for each. And this is going to sort our points. And then we're blasting the first one again, and then we just need to copy over this sort. Put it over here. And do a reverse. And this means we now again have to that's for our operation. And now we need to do that same transform trick we did beforehand with this cut horizontal. The cut horizontal is going to change a little bit. Because right now we want there to be a forward attribute on these points. There is. Instead of using a transform node, a point wrangle. And I'm going to offset everything by that forward attribute. So p at p plus equals forward. That's for 1. The other one just has to be the negative of this. Minus equals. This means that we have a point over here being moved in the correct directions, being in the same plane. Now we have another vertical slice instead of a horizontal slice. And this is what it will do for all the different slices. This is a very sturdy way to do your slicing. Just keep these close to you, so you have these slicers set up in the way you want them to work. Definitely a little bit artistic, where you want to use them and how you want to use them. You might not care about each different point, especially for sometimes you don't really care about the terrain points. Luckily, you should be able to get them as a group and dissolve them or delete them or do whatever you want to do for your building generator. For now, we are going to continue the module placement.